have Sian Roberts with us. Wish we'd had more
Delighted
to
to be
give
here.
you, but we're looking forward to really looking forward to this topic, which, for those who haven't read it recently, is Citizens of the World, Birmingham Quaker Women, Transnational Voluntary Service and the Meaning of Citizenship.
Okay.
It's about half the paper there.
That's it. Okay, right. Well, thank you. Thank you for the welcome. And I'd like to start, I suppose, with two quotes that sort of capture my themes, I suppose, this evening. The first will be familiar to you, I'm sure. At the Conservative Party conference in Birmingham last year, Theresa May made the following statement. But if you believe you're a citizen of the world, you're a citizen of nowhere. You don't understand what the very word citizenship means. Now, some 70 years earlier, in June 1945, a local newspaper in the Birmingham area published an obituary in which it posed the following question for its readers. How is it that the news of the death of a lady of 86 in a Worcestershire village will come with so strong a sense of personal loss, so great a thankfulness for the inspiration of her life, to out-of-the-way villagers in Madagascar, to workers in hospitals and schools in India and China, in Palestine, and among the mountains of Lebanon, to friends in the United States and others on the continent of Europe. And the author continued by saying that the answer may be sought, in part at least, in the Quaker home in Edgbaston, where she grew up as one of 8 brothers and sisters. Her parents, Mr. and Mrs. Arthur Albright, believed before all lesser considerations that their family was just part of God's great family, and that time, money and gifts of heart and mind were to be accounted for to God. It was their business if slaves were suffering in Africa and America, just as it was their concern if people in their own city were in want or sick in body or mind, and in need of any help the family could give. So from her early years, Miss Albright became a world citizen. Now, Maria Catherine Albright was one of a network of Birmingham Quaker women who were actively engaged in issues of peace, humanitarian relief, and educational and social reform on a transnational stage in the first half of the 20th century. They were part of a numerically small but disproportionately influential network of interrelated Quaker families that by the early 20th century were firmly established as members of Birmingham's manufacturing, business and civic political elite. And this paper draws on my ongoing research focusing on some of these, the women of these families. You see a few of them here behind me. They engaged in a wide range of local and national causes, including temperance, educational initiatives for adults, children and young people, penal and housing reform, and the physical and moral welfare of working class women and children in the city. They played leading roles in women-only organisations, but when required they also combined with Quaker and other men, including husbands, siblings and members of their extended kinship network. As well as the local national work in which they engaged, they were also active in transnational humanitarian relief, beginning with the First World War and continuing through the interwar period into the Spanish Civil War, and their work in support of refugees both in and from Europe in the 1930s and 40s. And it's this intersection of the local and the global in their lives and activism that I want to focus on this evening. I want to try and think about what Midgley Twells and Carlia recently referred to as the, quote, interactive relationship between local and global and how it can be traced through their lives. So it's thinking about the sort of question that's implicit in that statement by May, I suppose. How did they conceive of the role that they could and should play as Quaker women citizens, both of a very particular somewhere, urban Birmingham, and of the wider world. What prompted them to engage in such a broad range of issues in both local and global contexts? And how did their practices relate? Were their activities in these differing contexts rooted in the same fundamental principles? And now, obviously, I'm not going to talk about all of them. What I'm going to do is focus on a few episodes involving 2 or 3 of them to think about some of those questions and try and give you a flavour, I suppose, of how their ideas and motivating principles influence their activism in practical ways in the field, as it were. Now, although they're not a totally sort of homogenous group, as you'd expect, they have different interests and occasionally different political and social perspectives. But what they did share was a sense of responsibility to actively intervene in an attempt to bring forward a more just and more peaceful world. They perceived of this responsibility as a natural part of their identities as Quaker women, based on ideas of shared humanity, deriving from their belief as Quakers in that of God in everyone. So for most of them, not all, but for most, it was a responsibility that was rooted in their interpretation of their faith. And as Paul Cadbury recalled of his mother, Geraldine, her religion and her work were, quote, not 2 separate entities, but one balanced whole. Now, the responsibility to intervene was also specifically rooted in their personal witness for peace. And this is a significant motivation in the activism of Florence Barrow, who you see behind me. Florence's Quaker faith was the mainstay of her life, and all the causes in which she involved herself were a sort of manifestation of living out that faith in practice through action. So born in Birmingham in 1876, Florence was the only daughter of businessman and former mayor Richard Cadbury Barrow and his wife Jane Harrison. Growing up in a middle-class Quaker family, her early life displays numerous characteristics shared with my wider group of subjects. She was well educated, attending Edgbaston High School for girls. She was actively involved in the activities of her local Quaker meeting, and she was a lifelong supporter of the adult school movement, teaching a working-class women's class from 1894. A supporter of Birmingham Women's Suffrage Society, she was active in a number of social welfare and reform initiatives in the city. So from 1904, following a period of training at St Hilda's settlement in Bethnal Green, she involved herself in the work of Birmingham Women's Settlement, which had been founded a few years earlier in 1898 as a women-only settlement initially in one of the poorest areas of the city. She was a non-resident worker and later a member of the committee, and it's here that she developed a particular interest in working-class housing conditions. The First World War disrupted this sort of burgeoning settlement career as a settlement worker. From February 1916, Florence worked at a quarantine station for Serbian refugees in Friul near Marseille, before joining a Quaker relief team bound for Buzuluk in Russia with fellow Quaker Annie Wells, who was a local health visitor in Birmingham. In Russia, they worked on feeding, clothing and medical programs, educational initiatives, occupational workshops, orphanages and nurseries for children, and both women were in Russia during the revolutions of 1917, and that has an effect on Florence to some extent. Now, her extensive journals and correspondence from this period give us an insight into her motivation and the attitudes and beliefs that underpinned her work. She perceived of her relief work very much as a constructive part of her witness for peace, through the promotion of friendship and mutual understanding between women across sort of national, social and cultural divides. She was driven by a sense of responsibility to intervene practically through personal service, and that phrase, personal service, and her sort of sense of gratitude for the opportunity to serve in this way is a constant refrain in the archive. So in a letter from the refugee station in Friul, for example, she stressed, "I feel it is a great privilege to be here." For Florence, therefore, personal service was intimately bound up in the need to build personal relationships with the women with whom she worked. And this is reflected in her relief work in Russia and later in Poland. Her years of personal visiting to the homes of the women served by the Birmingham settlement stood her in good stead for the work that she and Annie embarked upon in Russia. They lived alongside refugee women and children in outlying villages, and their initial task was to visit hundreds of houses to quantify and assess the needs of the refugees, and as far as Florence was concerned, to get to know them. So her outlook was based on a sort of personal sympathy and a commitment to recognising and respecting the humanity of the individual and their experiences. Like her fellow relief worker Francesca Wilson, who's another one of my subjects, Florence emphasised the individual experience of the refugees in sort of personal vignettes that pepper her writings. And her descriptions stress the importance of personal interactions and convey a sense of duty to hear, record and disseminate the personal stories of individual refugees. So her emphasis is very much on the quality of the relationship rather than on delivering a more impersonal style of sort of mass relief. And in this, she and some of the other British Quaker women differ quite markedly from some of their American Quaker colleagues, and there's some evidence that they also differ from some of the British male relief workers. There is, it needs a bit more investigation, but there is some evidence there of a very sort of gendered outlook, if you like. Now, in her earlier work with the settlement, Florence had participated in service aimed at working class and poor women in particular. The settlement was based in Summer Lane, one of the poorest areas of Birmingham. And this included activities to promote the women's sense of self-respect and sense of self-worth through facilitating their desire for occupation. And that's also underpinned by her belief in the sort of Quaker ethos of self-help. And this sort of practice is what she takes forward in her work in Russia. She's very concerned that the refugee women are depressed and listless, and that they need occupation to develop their sense of self-worth. So in Russia, it took the form of occupational workshops for the women refugees, a common technique in Quaker relief in this period and in later conflicts like the Spanish Civil War, as well as in the 1930s schemes for the unemployed in Birmingham, in which she was also involved. So she organised sewing, knitting, weaving and fancy embroidery work, which raised morale, made a practical contribution in the form of useful garments, and earned the participants a small wage. There were also educational initiatives and a sort of rudimentary library service that was developed around the workshops at the same time. And the status and participation of women in the public sphere in the countries in which she was active also concerned her. She was horrified, for example, that so few of the women with whom she worked in Russia exercised their right to vote in a local election following the 1917 revolution. And she writes home saying, "Think how one felt to be here, the first time the women of the country had a vote, and no one knew enough to vote." So despite the power and class dynamic that sort of inevitably coloured both their settlement work at home and their relief work abroad, Florence and her fellow women relief workers were motivated by these ideas of friendship between women across boundaries of class, culture and nationality. And there is quite an interesting sort of self-reflective awareness of their own class and social privilege at play in some of their writings. Now, obviously, we have no independent record of how the displaced women themselves felt or how they viewed Florence's friendly visits, but she clearly believed that, quote, living in the villages among the people, we were able to become their friends. And she did develop long-term relationships in her work. So in Poland, for example, where she worked between 1919 and 1924, she actually makes active efforts to trace individual refugees with whom she'd worked in Russia a few years earlier, once they've returned home to Poland. She keeps in touch with several of them after returning home, and in 1936 she spent a month in Poland visiting some of the families with whom she'd worked several years earlier. And she carries this notion of friendship, this time across sort of divides of social class, into her work on housing on her return to Birmingham from Poland in 1924. She developed an interest in housing during her settlement days and had been heavily involved in housing refugees in both Russia and Poland. Once home in Birmingham, she threw herself into the reform of working class housing in the city as one of the founders of the Birmingham Quaker House Improvement Society Limited. Named after William Temple's Christian Conference on Politics, Economics and Citizenship held in Birmingham in 1924, the Quaker House Improvement Society was intended as a practical outcome of the conference that would leave a sort of legacy locally. And the aim obviously was to address the shortage of adequate housing, which was one of the major issues facing Birmingham City Council in the interwar period. Florence was a member of the COPEC committee from the start and honorary secretary from 1928 to 1954. Initially, it bought back-to-back slum properties, which it then renovated and rented out at fair rents. Later on, it also built new properties, and it developed facilities such as for the residents, such as the sort of women's club room that you can see behind me there, and the sort of children's play area and sandpit. And Florence sold the house to buy the first properties, which is that row of houses that you see in the top corner there. 19 back-to-back houses in Pope Street in Birmingham, inner city area. And she also acted as a rent collector in Nechells, which again is one of the poorest areas in the city. And COPEC...
Was that in the 60s, around the 60s, or was it earlier?
What?
The COPEC stuff, when she was doing the work in COPEC.
COPEC, she starts in 1924. And carries on, well, she carries on into the 50s with it, certainly. It's now part of one of the housing associations in the city, Midland Heart. It's sort of amalgamated and all the rest of it. COPEC's first annual report stated that one of the society's aims was, quote, to humanise the relationship of landlord and tenant in this class of property. And therefore, the collection of rents was in the hands of Miss Barrow and 2 other women. The aim was to be, quote, a friend of the family, where there is a need for such a relationship, not merely seeing that the houses are in good condition and the rents regularly paid. So we see sort of similar themes informing her relief work abroad and some of the work in which she's involved at home in Birmingham. And this theme of friendship between women across boundaries of class or nationalities also runs through the activities of Florence's friend and co-worker Catherine Albright, the woman whose obituary I opened with. Born in 1859, Catherine was the youngest but one of the children of the Quaker manufacturer and businessman Arthur Albright and his wife Rachel Stacey. Like Florence, she was a product of Edgbaston High School for Girls, grew up in an affluent middle-class family, and an extended kinship network that had a long tradition of involvement in social, political and humanitarian causes, locally, nationally and internationally, most notably the anti-slavery cause. Her father, Arthur Albright, for example, was the leader of the National Freedmen's Aid Union in 1866, and several of the women in both her and Florence's family were involved in the Birmingham Ladies' Society for the Relief of Negro Slaves. So Catherine herself was involved in a number of activities and causes over the course of her life. Local and national structures of the Society of Friends, Quaker educational initiatives such as Woodbrook, and for anyone who doesn't know, Woodbrook was the educational settlement founded by George Cadbury, Wilhelm Rowntree and others in Selly Oak, both to provide training in the ministry of the Society of Friends for both men and women, but also to provide training in social service. She was also involved in adult education, particularly for women, as a class teacher and office holder regionally and nationally. She was involved in the local women's movement, including, again, the Birmingham Women's Suffrage Society, the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, National Union of Women Workers, National Council of Women, that kind of thing. And she travelled widely on behalf of the Society of Friends, involving herself in missionary and educational issues, in refugee relief and in humanitarian aid. And as chair of the Friends Service Council, which is the official missionary and relief agency of the British Society of Friends, between 1927 and 1934, she was at the helm of a global missionary and humanitarian relief organisation. So in 1900, Catherine joined the committee of the Birmingham Women's Settlement, and in 1906 she agreed to act as the settlement's unsalaried warden, a post which she held until 1910 with Cecile Matheson as a paid deputy and later joint warden. During their wardenship, the settlement ran a Providence Society, clubs and lectures for local women and girls, a kindergarten, day trips and holidays in the country. They collected rents, ran a women's employment bureau, a poor man's lawyer who advised on cases of separation and maintenance payments, and they also developed a certificated training course in social work with Birmingham University and Woodbrook Quaker Settlement. And in her addresses to the settlement's annual meetings, Catherine stressed its mission of promoting friendship between women of different classes and developing the, quote, personal ties upon which the settlement was based. And this is a recurring theme in all of her activities, and it comes to the fore again during the First World War, when she was one of the founders and initial secretary of the Birmingham Community Club for Women. So established at the instigation of members of the National Union of Women Workers, the Birmingham Community Club was based on a similar supper club in Leeds and held its first open meeting in February 1917. In September 1917, in an article in Women Workers, which was the quarterly magazine of the Birmingham branch of the National Union of Women Workers, which you see the cover of one of them behind me, I'm sure you're very familiar with it, Catherine explained that the name Community Club was chosen to indicate, quote, the spirit of good fellowship aimed at among the members, as well as the spirit of loyalty to the community as a whole. The aim was to provide, quote, a place where women of all ranks could meet on common ground. And this was what she felt differentiated it from the existing women's organisations in the city. The membership was open to women of every kind, quote, old and young, married and single, professional women, industrial women, and just wives, whether of employers or employees. Part of the initial motivation was due to the influx of women into Birmingham to work in the munitions industries during the First World War and in other war-related occupations. And they try very hard to sort of address class and socio-economic distinctions between the women through the application process for membership, through the subscription rates, and also the arrangements for meetings. And in her article, Catherine explained that 200 women had enrolled in the first 6 months, and this number was continuing to rise. And she went on to list the diversity of occupations represented in the initial membership. The ultimate aim was to represent all of the women of Birmingham, every different sort of type of woman, if you like. I won't read out all of the different occupations, you can see them there on the slide behind me. But she concluded that no one can have been a member, even for a short time, without coming into friendly intercourse with some whom otherwise she would never have had the chance of knowing. However successful it was in recruiting women from a broad range of occupations, it's much harder to tell how diverse the membership was in terms of class and background. There's no complete membership list, unfortunately, but there are indications that, unsurprisingly, the aspiration to recruit and represent women from across the social spectrum wasn't particularly successful, certainly to begin with. The minutes in April 1917, for example, record that efforts had been made to reach the workers in certain industrial firms in the city, but without much success. And the fact that the minutes of November 1917 make a point of recording the election to membership of Mrs. Eglin, a working woman from Ladywood, suggests that this was a sort of noteworthy and unusual event. The meetings were well attended. There were between 75 and 100 women present at each one. And as well as providing a space for social interaction between women of sort of different ranks, in inverted commas, the club also had an educational role. It was intended as a space in which to discuss and to educate women in active citizenship, in participation in the public sphere, and in paid employment. So the programmes that you see behind me are from 1917 and 1918, and they give a flavour of the activities. So we have George Cadbury Jr. giving a talk on the housing problem in the city, which had been exacerbated by this influx of women munition workers in particular. We have a debate on whether children should be endowed by the state, a talk on the advantages of communal kitchens, different occupations that are open to women and the conditions associated with them. Miss Gibson, a trade union organiser, talks on should women be allowed to earn £5 a week. There's a talk on labour-saving devices for the home, and fellow Quaker Geraldine Cadbury, who was a voluntary probation officer in Birmingham's pioneering children's court, and would become the city's first woman magistrate. She talks on what Birmingham is doing for its difficult children. And again, a slightly later programme from 1920-21, we see again a stress on women's occupations and their working conditions. Education is a sort of perennial theme. Penal reform, again by another Quaker, Marjorie Fry, and a debate on the party political system as a form of governance. Catherine's long-standing interest in peace and international issues are also reflected on the programme, in this case with an address on the League of Nations, and she herself contributed lectures on other occasions on the situation in India, for example. She was a supporter of Tagore and Gandhi, who both visited Woodbrook in this period. And she also made a point of inviting women from different countries to contribute to the discussions, drawing on the international students that were based at Woodbrook and some of the other Selly Oak colleges. So the club and its activities reflect the interest in citizenship education among women's organisations. And it wasn't the only form of citizenship education that my group of women engaged in. Another of my subjects, Margaret Backhouse, who was a lecturer in Sunday school and youth work at West Hill Training College, Selly Oak. She, for example, was very active in citizenship education for adolescent girls through her local and national leadership of the Campfire Girls organisation. and its programme had a strong citizenship strand designed basically to prepare teenage girls for leadership positions in women's organisations and to participate in the political life of the nation, sort of in a sort of post-suffrage society. And all these activities reflect the sort of shared commitment among my group of women to encouraging participation by women in the sort of public and political spheres. Now, in addition to the influence of their religious beliefs, which we've touched on, they're also influenced to varying degrees by sort of discourses of equality and social reconstruction that are increasingly permeating the Society of Friends in this period. And this is probably most obvious in the case of Theodora Wilson, who also combined local sort of voluntary activism with a commitment to peace and international issues. Theodora was born in Leighton Buzzard in 1865 and moved to Birmingham on her marriage in 1890 to local businessman Henry Lloyd Wilson, who shared many of her interests. They were both active in local Quaker concerns and educational initiatives, and Theodora had a particular interest in maternity and child welfare. She was instrumental in the founding of one of the earliest infant welfare centres in Birmingham in 1905 and had been co-opted onto Birmingham City Council's Maternity and Child Welfare Committee in 1915. During the war, she was active in peace campaigns as chair of the local branch of the Women's International League and the Women's Peace Crusade in the city. And in May 1919, she attended the second Congress of the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom in Zurich as a member of the British delegation. And in the same period, she visits Germany on a sort of investigative journey to look at post-war conditions and the sort of food shortages in the post-war period. And she disseminates these accounts of the conditions through her local Quaker meetings, but also through the National Friends Gathering yearly meeting, where she described, quote, the murder by slow process of millions of women and children and old people, and advocated action to raise awareness and funds for relief. So Theodora and her husband Henry were both leading supporters of the Independent Labour Party in South Birmingham. And in 1923, she stands for election as a Labour councillor for Selly Oak, and she's the only woman elected in the Birmingham municipal elections of that year. This is a copy of her election leaflet, which you probably can't read from over there. But she campaigned for election on the basis that every ward should have at least one woman councillor, and on issues that have come to be recognised as sort of women's issues in the interwar period. So the need for municipal housing and fair rents, unemployment, educational grants to enable working class children to stay at school beyond the age of 14, and maternity and child welfare provision. And she goes on to chair Birmingham City Council's Maternity and Child Welfare Subcommittee for some years until the early 1930s. And Theodora and Henry reflect this trend amongst some Quakers in this period to engage in more socially and politically radical movements. And also they reflect the sort of internal discussions within the Society of Friends about the development of what became known as a new social outlook in the interwar period. The late 19th century had seen profound changes in the Society of Friends, with the development of what the historian Thomas Kennedy has termed the Quaker Renaissance. So there's a shift from a very sort of evangelical Quakerism towards the more sort of liberal Quakerism that we might recognise today, or aspects of it. So it's a more sort of socially engaged and outwardly focused idea of Quakerism. And the First World War continues this shift. A committee on war and social order was created by the Society in 1915, which was heavily influenced by socialist Quakers, some of them closely associated with Woodbrook Settlement in Birmingham and with the Ploughshare, which you see there, the organ of socialist Quakers in which Henry Theodora's husband was actively involved. And this War and Social Order Committee drew up a radical social and political critique for the Society of Friends, which was formally adopted by the 1918 yearly meeting and is known as the 8 Foundations of True Social Order. And there are a few of them up there. I didn't have space for all 8 of them, but you'll see the first one there describes an idea of society which knows no restriction of race, sex or social class, for example. And the last one at the bottom of the slide, mutual service should be the principle upon which life is organised. Service, not private gain, should be the motive of all work. And a member of the society, of the committee that drew up the Foundations for a True Social Order, Lucy Fryer-Morland, she's a head teacher from Croydon. She expands on this theme when she delivered the Swarthmore Lecture in 1918, parts of which resonate strongly with the sort of beliefs that I've described that are held by Florence and Catherine, Theodora and the other women in my group. So ideas around the need for personal service and for a particular collaborative rather than hierarchical attitude to that service. And a huge emphasis is placed on the role of education in particular in building this new social order. So there's a very short quote there from what is a much longer lecture, where she writes, "When all have leisure and education, each can contribute his special gifts for the common good. The choice is varied, but the service should be in the direction of doing good with, rather than in doing good to, any set of people." And we see those ideas gradually sort of permeating the sort of work that my women is involved in. So in the context of international relief, by the 1940s, Francesca Wilson, another of my subjects, is writing about how refugees, for example, should participate democratically in all the decisions that are made about the relief that's delivered to them. So it's quite a shift in style. And we can see that Florence too was influenced by these currents. She reacted favourably to the Russian Revolution and joined the local branch of the Independent Labour Party in 1919 with her brother Harrison, who'd recently been released from prison for contravening the Defence of the Realm Acts. A talk she gave to her team of relief workers in Poland just after she was appointed head of the team of 80 delivering Quaker relief in that country in 1921 provides an insight into how she conceived of the relationship between local political and social issues and international issues of war and peace. One of her team, Bernard Priestman, described her presentation as absolutely it, a trumpet call to social work. And after a most interesting enumeration of the welfare programme in Birmingham, ended by showing how the effects always should bring us into grips with the causes. Ill health equals housing, unemployment equals modern industrialism, ill health and unemployment combined equals war. I ought to add that the religious note was sounded clearly at the beginning. So, just a few sort of reflections to conclude. The same faith-inspired principles and practices underpinned the work of these women across a range of local and global contexts. Their activism was rooted in an understanding of women's role in the world and a sense of responsibility and entitlement to intervene as local and global citizens and to contribute constructively to international peace and social change. In contrast to Mrs. May and her quote at the beginning, their understanding of citizenship recognised no national boundaries, and they saw no contradiction between their social activism for the benefit of the local community, be that in the settlement, the adult school, the community club, or in housing initiatives, and the global service they performed for peace and international understanding. Indeed, both aspects were intimately connected for them. They were sort of two sides of the same coin. They believed that to achieve a more just and peaceful world, that one had to be sort of outward looking and cultivate friendship and understanding across boundaries of culture, language and nationality on the international stage, or across divides of social class at home. Under the influence of a more politically and socially radical discourse within the Society of Friends, they were on a sort of evolutionary journey from a fairly traditional philanthropic discourse at the beginning of the period in which they're active to sort of more egalitarian ideas that we would probably now term as social justice. They believed that as women they had a key role to play in developing a better and more equal world in the aftermath of war, a new world which could only be fully realised if women of all ranks played an active part as informed citizens in its construction and governance. And they do draw on sort of historical perspectives very self-consciously to do this. They legitimate their action by referring back to sort of mothers, grandmothers, aunts who have been involved over several generations. There's a very active sort of cultural transmission of these ideas about global citizenship that's transmitted from generation to generation in these families and their very sort of extended kinship network. So the activism which Florence and the fellow Quaker women that I've discussed formed a vital part of their identities as Quaker women. It was a lifelong commitment in which they consciously drew upon a very interventionist Quaker feminine identity that supported their authority as women to engage fully as citizens in both local and global arenas. And I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Well, thank you very much. It's fascinating, absolutely fascinating. Okay, we've got time for questions and discussion, so the floor is open. Bill?
Can I, if you took another lens and said, let's look at the Baptist women or the Methodist women, could you find similar?
Oh, sure you could. I mean, sort of ideas around sort of Christian citizenship and sort of Christian service in particular.
Yeah.
You'd find, I guess, similar motivations at work in
and did you find, were there any cooperative committees or were they doing their own thing?
They do both.
Yes.
They some of the work in which they're involved is just women, but women, across a sort of women of all faiths and none, as it were. They're also heavily involved in, so for example, during the First World War, in sort of work for Belgian refugees, for example, where there's a whole spread of different faith groups, and they make a very active effort to include women from the Jewish community and men from the Jewish community, for example, in Birmingham. So it's a bit of a mixture. I think they tend to see something that needs doing, and then it's about finding the most pragmatic or the most practical way of doing it, I think.
Thank you.
What sort of numbers are you talking about, these women, Quaker women?
Quakers are quite a small So in Birmingham, they are numerically they're quite small, but because of their sort of demographic profile, you know, on the whole, they're middle class, they're well educated, and they, for various reasons, they belong to the sort of business and sort of professional structures in the city. So they're not a huge group, but one of the issues I have is that as soon as I start looking at one of them, I find, you know, a whole network of others. And Birmingham is, I think, is slightly different because of the establishment in Birmingham of Woodbrook Quaker settlement, which is international from the start. So people come from all over the world, particularly Scandinavia, parts of the Empire, and oh yeah, 1903-04. You know, lots of Scandinavian students, lots of students from the Netherlands, and then the other Selly Oak colleges operate in the same way. And I think those institutions, although they're not all officially Quaker institutions like Woodbrook is, on the whole they're Quaker founded and Quaker led, and they attract, I think, a particular type of Quaker. So they attract the sort of Quaker that's going to be attracted to this more sort of outward, socially engaged type, if you like. They're less, you know, they're sort of more conservative, because there are more conservative Quakers who, you know, don't engage so much in these sorts of issues. So yeah, I've got 6 or 7 main women who I'm looking at, but then there's another probably 20 who are involved in similar things, but for shorter periods of time.
So it's quite small numbers.
Oh yeah. But obviously, if you look at other, because as I say, they're a very small, you know, in terms of numbers, they're quite a small group. But there are other places. I mean, I know Ruth Davidson has done work on Croydon, and she's found Quaker women similarly there are very well represented in sort of women's organisations and, you know, campaigns for the same sorts of issues, both locally and in sort of peace campaigning and that sort of thing. York, Newcastle would probably be another centre where you'd see a sort of similar concentration, I suppose.